understand the experience of the individuals who are going to be walking into your living grace group, it's helpful to have a clinical understanding of how mental illness is defined. Mental illnesses are circumstances or genetic factors causing a disruption in the brain that affects thoughts, moods, behaviors, and relationships. And the severity of these symptoms requires professional intervention, a whole health or holistic approach, and community support. They really need to have others around them to walk alongside them through this journey. But because mental illness can be pretty confusing, I think looking at the proof is extremely helpful. So we're going to take a look at a couple of brain images to show you exactly what is happening in some of the most important areas of the brain. So this image on the left is of a brain of an individual who is not struggling with depression. Really notice the rich colors, the yellows and the oranges, and those colors indicate activity. Now, here is an image of a brain of someone living with depression. You can see the vast difference in colors and the lack of activity in the brain on the right. And I want to point out one specific area that you'll notice is pretty dark in the brain with depression. It's this area that's circled in red. And this is where our prefrontal cortex is, which is the part of the brain where our emotional control, judgment, and insight comes from. It helps us make plans and control impulses. And so the lack of bright colors in this area indicates a disruption of activity here. So if that area of the brain is inhibited, it's no shock that we start to see things like disorganization, confusion, impulsive behavior, and mood instability. And on the flip side, we can also look at brain images for other disorders, such as bipolar disorder and anxiety and panic. And in these images, we have almost the opposite situation in the prefrontal cortex as the brain with depression. Instead of a diminished activity level, the prefrontal cortex is working on overdrive. One other area of the brain to look at in these images is the thalamus, which is in that middle circle. The thalamus is the area of the brain that is partially responsible for filtering all of the senses that our body receives. And this area dictates how we sense life around us. So with this overactive thalamus, it's easy for an individual to begin to have faulty perceptions of how they're actually experiencing life. So they're filtering neutral events with a negative filter. Now take this overactive brain and place yourself at a church with loud music and lots of people and a bunch of lights. So for someone with extremely sensitive senses, this can be a really negative experience and even lead to sensory overload. And then lastly, when we look at the brain image with anxiety or panic, we get some insight into someone who's experienced trauma and might be living with PTSD. And another part of the brain within this circle here is the amygdala, which is responsible for our fear responses. And when someone's amygdala is overactive, they're stuck in threat mode, that fight or flight mode. And so as a result, we typically observe three major symptom categories. They experience re-experiencing, which includes things like flashbacks or nightmares or intrusive thoughts. They experience avoidance, like isolation, depression, and guilt. And also hyperarousal, which is kind of this feeling on edge or restless or irritable. But the physical, emotional, and mental effects are not the only effects individuals are experiencing with their mental health difficulties. We can also take a look at these brain images to gain some insight into how mental illness can also have a great impact on someone's faith. So with disorders such as depression, anxiety, and PTSD, individuals can often experience something called anhedonia, which is the lack of pleasurable emotions. And this disruption we see in the prefrontal cortex and other parts of the brain leave individuals with a sense of being unable to feel. So no matter how much scripture they read or how many people tell them to trust the Lord and choose joy, they're still left with this inability to connect with God on an emotional level. And the advice that people often give in these situations can trigger them into even greater insecurity and scrupulous thinking. And this is the other effect that individuals experience, scrupulosity. And scrupulosity is ongoing moral or religious guilt. I'm not enough, I can't do anything right. And because of anhedonia and scrupulosity, the biggest complaint of someone living with depression is that they can't connect with or experience God. Imagine feeling like you can't connect with God and how that experience would just continue to increase your anxiety. For many, we see that racing anxiety result in an insecurity in their assurance of salvation or God's presence in their lives. And the higher the anxiety, the more that they struggle over their salvation. The anhedonia and scrupulosity can also lead to racing thoughts of unworthiness. And the disruption that's occurring within the brain is impacting their ability to regulate these negative, intrusive thoughts. So they may try to pray or even take action to make these thoughts go away, which often results in an extreme sense of failure. And the ongoing failure creates something that we call learned helplessness. I've failed so much, therefore I am a failure. They take this on as an identity. I'm not enough, I need to do more. And this ends up perpetuating their insecurity about their salvation and inability to connect with God, creating a vicious cycle. Mania and psychosis can also have a large impact on the way an individual experiences their faith. An individual living with mania experiences a heightened mood and a greater sense of impulsivity, an overactive brain. Moods and thoughts and responses are not being regulated, so impulsivity is running wild based on the reward system in their brain. With psychosis, we see three types of symptoms. First, we see positive symptoms. There are things that are there or added on that were not present before the individual became ill, such as delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thoughts, or even impaired speech. And then negative symptoms indicate a decrease in or loss of normal functions. This can include a lack of interest in people, isolation, inability to feel or display emotions, or difficulties with thinking or coming up with ideas. And then you have psychomotor symptoms, which are changes in movement, such as slowed speech or slowed movement and slow walking. It can also include odd gestures or movements or even tactile hallucinations. And when it comes to faith for these individuals, it's important to understand that individuals experiencing mania and psychosis are often filtering their faith and their life through their symptoms. And in psychology, they refer to this as hyper-religiosity. So there's no need to tell them in the moment that this is what they're experiencing is hyper-religiosity. What is helpful is to remember that their experiences are 100% real to them. It is their reality in that moment. And we also see that individuals in these states have a strong sense of revelation and works. And they may think that God is speaking to them or revealing things to them. They believe that all of the new information they're receiving from God has equated to a new calling upon their lives, and they have to go do this thing. So there are a lot of works that are tied to these revelations. And some of these messages that they're receiving are very critical and judgmental, which is an indication that they are probably the result of the symptoms they're experiencing. And because of the symptoms of psychosis and even a heightened mood, they may also attribute what they're experiencing as spiritual warfare or even demonic possession. I'm being attacked, there's a demonic presence in me. And lastly, individuals experiencing mania or psychosis are usually experiencing something called anosognosia, or an unawareness that there is a problem. So trying to get them help can become a real challenge. So during your group, you might encounter someone with little insight or self-awareness that what they're experiencing or hearing or believing is a result of their symptoms. And it's important not to correct or tell them what they're experiencing is not real, because in that moment, it is fully real to them. And challenging or discounting their experience will only become a greater trigger. Instead, just be gracious and point them back to the grace of God and any truths that might be surfacing in their experiences. Now, after spending time walking through what an individual with mental health difficulties may be experiencing, it's kind of easy to become discouraged and even a little scared. Yet, we're here to tell you that there is hope, and that's where this Living Grace group comes in.